Hi, Wanjiku.
The streaming on Facebook. Perfect. I guess perhaps maybe we're simulating a real conference where the speakers might be at the top of the room having some chats beforehand as people mail into the room. But yeah, we'll hang on until we have all of our speakers and then we can get started with the event.
Yeah. Katie, I hope you managed to send link to everybody because some people are saying they didn't receive. Sure.
Some people didn't receive the link, Salome, did they?
No, I don't know, but anyway.
Should have gone out with Eventbrite automatically. I can push another email to attendees to make sure that they can log in.
We're experiencing difficulties to get in. I don't know.
Okay, it looks like everyone who registered online has been emailed about it twice with the link. So I'm not sure if people are saying that they don't have the link, then they should maybe check their emails, see if it went into spam. But that's just in case anybody's hearing from anyone struggling to get in.
Yeah, you can see from the chat there, people are saying they've joined through the Eventbrite account. So it's probably just another way of joining in. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can start, Katie.
Salome, did you hear that Siobhan would be joining us later, closer to her speaking time?
Okay, that's
So that we don't have no, but I just wondering if you heard that from her.
No.
Because I think aside from that, we have our full full panel.
Yeah, that's fine. If she's not there by the time we just go to Hanana, that's fine.
Yeah, we can hop over.
Yeah.
Okay, well, conscious of keeping people waiting, I'd like to welcome everybody for attending today. Thank you for your patience if you've been logged in for a few minutes. And yeah, we're really excited to celebrate the 16 days of activism in eliminating gender-based violence. We have a great lineup today with our own research to launch done by the lovely Sharon, and we have expert panelists speaking on trafficking, on gender-based violence, on forced marriages, speaking both from the front line as service providers and as high-level policymakers. Today, we want to make sure that everybody feels as open as possible to join in on the discussion. So use the chat feature and the Q&A as much as you like, and we'll put those questions to the panelists in our discussion time. I will hand over now to our Head of Operations and Strategy, Salome Mbugua, a longtime advocate for female rights and founder of AkiDwA, and she will moderate the first portion of the day. Presentations from Sharon Itakana, from Siobhan Mullally, and from Hanana Siddiqui. So over to you, Salome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, everybody, for attending this afternoon. I really take this opportunity to thank everybody who have left everything else that they were doing to be able to join us in this webinar on sexual and gender-based violence at this very difficult time when we are actually trying to overcome and, overcome the challenge that we have of COVID-19. As you've heard, my name is Salome Mbugua, and I work with AkiDwA as Head of Operations and Strategy. Our conference today has attracted many participants. We have over 410 people registered, if everybody managed to get in. For the sake of those who don't know about our work and our organization, we have actually a website, but I want to explain to you a little bit of whom we are and what we do. Let me give a short introduction that relates to what you're going to talk about then before I invite our speakers for this first session of the webinar itself. AkiDwA, which means sisterhood, it's a Swahili word for sisterhood, is a national network of migrant women living in Ireland. We were established in 2001 to provide a platform for migrant women where we can speak for ourselves, articulate our needs, and as well solutions to these needs. From the informal setting to professional and credible organization, that our organization has now become a very recognized organization in Ireland. And actually, we have actually been articulating on the issues that pertain to migrant women, whether it's women asylum seekers who are living in accommodation centers, with all our reports that we have done, and most of them are on website, issues of direct provision and abolishing direct provision. We didn't start talking about them now. We've actually started talking about them a long time ago. And also issues of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation of migrant women. AkiDwA as an organization has achieved a lot for and with migrant women. We are a feminist organization, migrant-led, with a vision and mission for promoting equality and justice for migrant women in Ireland. Our organization is governed by a board of directors and currently have 5 staff, 3 interns, and volunteers delivering variable activities and support for migrant women. which include capacity building training, training on reproductive health, training on active citizenship, and on many other areas like on female genital mutilation, which our organization is very well known to be working on. At AkiDwA, we apply different approaches to achieve our mission and vision, working with migrant women of different background and immigration status. Our work is guided by our strategic plan launched last year, which has 4 key objectives: ensuring that the migrant women have the voices and they are voicing their issues that pertain to them and their family, about equality, equality of treatment, equality of opportunity, and equality of access for migrant women and their families, about the community and the mobilization of the community of migrant women in Ireland as well. And as well, we want to be able to be competent enough as an organization that we are sufficient and effective in the way we carry on our business. This actually a key objective of our work is supported by 3 key areas of work. And in AkiDwA, we focus on 3 key areas. The first one is on health. The second one is on sexual and gender-based violence, of which we are focusing on today. And the other one is actually on integration, where we look at the broad aspect of integration, but really focusing on issues like racism, discrimination, issues of access to employment, issues of access to anything that women are trying to access, including the access to health. For the purpose of this webinar, we will focus on sexual and gender-based violence. And our only 2 areas, which I'll explain now, that in the sexual and gender-based violence, because sexual and gender-based violence is very broad. AkiDwA work on SGBV mainly focuses on female genital mutilation, domestic violence, and in recent times, we have been exploring trafficking and forced marriages through mapping and research due to several cases that we have come across actually as an organization. In terms of female genital mutilation, our statistics actually shows that we have 5,975 women who are living in this country that have been subjected to female genital mutilation. And we have almost 6,000 children who are at risk of female genital mutilation. And indeed, on January 29th, we saw the first conviction of female genital mutilation of a family that had actually subjected their daughter to female genital mutilation, a 2-year-old girl. Our work on FGM is supported by the Health Services Executive Social Inclusion Unit. However, Ireland is yet to develop a national action plan on female genital mutilation and set up a coordinated approach to be able to ensure women and girls are protected fully. In regard to domestic violence, AkiDwA has been supporting women experiencing violence, meeting them, accompanying them, and referring them to other services like refuges and other places where they can be supported, including to Immigrant Council of Ireland, where we have a memorandum of understanding on them supporting women that need legal services. We've actually seen so many women coming to our offices. As I speak now, one of our staff, actually 2 of them are in the office. They support women on a daily basis, women who are experiencing violence. So this time of pandemic have actually seen so many women coming to seek for services and support in our office. And we are trying actually to do that, even though with very limited support. We've also seen so many young women come out to speak about issues of sexual harassment and actually sexual violence issues, including women living in direct provision. And this is actually a warning trend that is going on now. This issue of domestic violence will be discussed more in our General Assembly, which is on 5th of December. So if you want to hear more about our work on domestic violence, which we will not focus on this webinar, please send an email to AkiDwA so that you can come to our General Assembly to hear on what is happening and what needs to be done on this area. The discussion on our webinar today will focus more on trafficking of migrant women, and in particular African women into Ireland. It will also focus on forced marriages. I just want to take you back to what has been happening.
It's a background noise.
70% of worldwide trafficked women and girls, but 53% of these trafficked, are for sexual exploitation. 70% of worldwide trafficked are women and girls, and 53% of these are indeed for the purpose of sexual exploitation. We've had, for example, in our work, even with the European Network of Migrant Women, who are represented in this webinar today, in November 2017, when bodies of 26 young Nigerian women and girls were retrieved from the Mediterranean Sea. They were probed to be victims of sex trafficking ring. In the last few years, through our outreach work in AkiDwA, and mainly through accommodation centers, we've come across many women, and when they talk to us and explain to us about their journey and how they've ended up in Ireland, come across really very clearly that they've been trafficked to Ireland. While others have come seeking support, our concern has been mainly for the women from the African continent, who seem to be actually majority, even for those seeking support from Ruhama itself. And we'll hear more about this when Sharon actually comes to talk about it. As a result, we decided to undertake a baseline research on this area and focusing on trafficking of African women in Ireland. I want to give you a scenario. Imagine you are 26 years old from the rural part of Nigeria, and a man, the way they call the trafficker, approaches you, promising you a great job, which will buy you a house, a car, and give you so much support for your family back home. After your family selling all the valuable goods, they have you accompany a man and have been traveling from one country to another. You have become a prisoner and tied to brothel, pushed to sleep with many men per day, and even after many months, you have not been able to be paid or taken to a job you had been promised. This is the case of so many trafficked women who end up actually here. Ireland, as we know, serves as both country of destination and transit for women trafficked. And Wanjiko from Baso will talk about this and how they actually support women on the border. I will now call Sharon, who actually undertook the survey or the mapping, the baseline research on trafficking on behalf of AkiDwA, to give us more about the outcome of this research. Sharon is a lawyer with a master in human rights in criminal justice, a member of the Nigerian Bar. She's also the founder of Empower Tribe, an online community for the empowerment of women. She's an advocate for human rights for marginalized community, especially women. Sharon, you're very much welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Salome. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that we have a large number of attendees, and I have modeled my presentation today to suit just people who don't really understand much about trafficking, to give them an understanding about it, as well as organizations who might be here, stakeholders who might have been playing a strong role in tackling trafficking in Ireland. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Please tell me if you can see what's on my screen.
No, that looks good, Sharon.
Okay.
Seems to be working.
Thank you. I've been struggling with the tech team. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to start with the background, but then Salome has done a fantastic job in just introducing where AkiDwA stands on all this. Let me just reiterate that we believe that trafficking of women is a form of gender-based violence. And over the years, in the course of AkiDwA's work, they had encountered several women, amongst whom have been referred to them, whose stories sounded like stories of victims of human trafficking, and in their own way have referred people. But now, as an organization, AkiDwA has decided that, you know, we can do more. We are in a position to do more just because of where we sit in the community of migrant women. And so for this reason, we have decided to undertake this research to fulfill the following objective. First off, we want to understand the African context, as well as raise awareness of specific issues that pertain to African women and girls who are victims of trafficking. Soon enough, I will show statistics, or I will just highlight statistics that show the extent to which African migrant women form majority of victims of human trafficking. And as a result, it is necessary to highlight the plight or the context of African women if we are to effectively tackle trafficking in Ireland, especially in relation to sexual exploitation. We also intended to document the violations of women and girls from the countries of origin right on to their transit to their destination, as well as identify strategies to prevent these kind of things from happening. As well as I said, AkiDwA hopes that after we have gone through this research, after this whole conference today, we will be able to reflect on how to best shape our own policy in line with international standards and the work that exists in Ireland as well. So with human trafficking, it's a very interesting industry in that it operates in the shadows. So unlike other research where the typical approach might be, especially in social research, to interview participants and victims, it's quite tough because the scars that come with human trafficking are very much internal and they're mental. So it's difficult to see the extent to which a victim might have healed. And as a result, victims of human trafficking in the course of sharing their stories are very much open to re-traumatization. So we leaned into literature review as well as consultation with expert organizations. Fortunately, we were able to still get a couple of strong voices of victims as well, just about 3 of them. It was very ambitious of us to try and get some victims, but thankfully, some strong survivors decided to speak to us, and we would be hearing just experts and quotes of what they had to say in the course of my presentation today. So firstly, what is human trafficking? It is very much the intertwine of these three based, it's very much the intertwine of three factors. So the act, the means, and the purpose. So it's the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, and receiving persons. So when we think of migrant women, we have to think of the recruiting, the transporting, the transferring. This implies mobility, the moving about of women, African women from the African continent to Europe. So this is me just putting the African women in perspective into the definition of trafficking here. And so it says this is done by means of force, threats of force, or other forms of violence, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or position of responsibility, or receiving or giving of gifts or payments. Before I go on to the next bit, I just want to highlight that yes, trafficking of women happens to migrant women, but it can also happen to women anywhere who are residents in any country, because trafficking can happen if a victim is harbored by the means listed earlier for the purposes of sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, forced begging, forced criminality, organ removal, or any other type of exploitation. And I think that's what's very important about this definition, because this definition is what is entrenched in Irish law as well as EU law. The provision of other types of exploitation leaves room for the recognition of multiple victims. That way, we're not saying your own trauma or your own disadvantage is more important than the other. There is an umbrella for levels of exploitation. But as we have highlighted earlier, we are focusing on sexual exploitation. So in Ireland, over the last 5 years, there has been 319 documented victims of human trafficking. And as we can see, there is a consistent and continuous domination of the statistics where women have increased numbers. And so this is invariably a gender issue. We already see from the continuous statistic that there is a role of that women form particular victims of this crime, and for that reason, it's important that we consider the trafficking of women. When we look at the countries of origin, we see straight away that Nigeria has an overwhelming majority. So we see the need, as I was explaining earlier, to focus on African women, because in the absence of this, it is not necessarily possible to tackle effectively trafficking in Ireland if you do not look at it from an African women perspective. So before we go into that, before we go in deeply, I just want to give a little route map here as to where we're going to go and then go in so that I can keep you with me. So firstly, we'd be looking at the causes of trafficking. We'd be looking at what draws victims into trafficking in Europe, in Ireland specifically. And then we'll be looking at what pushes victims from Africa to Ireland. Thereafter, we'll be looking at the policy that exists in Ireland to tackle human trafficking, and then highlighting the challenges in that policy from an African perspective and raising recommendations. So with that said, I will go on now to look at the synthesis of push and pull factors. First off, let's take the pull factors. What drags people, or what draws people into Ireland? Well, not just people, let's be more specific. What draws African women into Ireland to be trafficked for sex? One, the demand for sex. In the recent SERP reports, we see that over 650 women are typically advertised for prostitution online every day. When I was going through the Ruhama's reports for 2018, we could see that there was, when it comes to the sex industry in Ireland, there's a large proportion of women, of course. And when we look at on-street prostitution, that's right on the streets, road work, there is a homogeneity of Irish women and even just generally white women. We don't see African women on the streets as much. And this goes to highlight the fact that there is hidden activity going on. There is the private markets of coerced trafficked women happening that might not be as transient or as prevalent on the streets. So there is a demand for sexual services in Ireland and in Europe in general. And this is the reason, or this is the push factor, a major pull factor, sorry, that attracts women from Africa to Ireland. Economic prospects, higher standard of living, safety, and the allure of the West. I will take all these together because they're all very much interlinked. Fortunately, Europe and the United States, I think these are, when we talk of the West, these are Western powers, and they have advanced economically. It is no secret the extent of safety in comparison to places like Africa, where there might be more terrorism activity, but it might just be underreported. So we see that the good standard of living and the higher pay available in the West serves to be an interesting pull factor for people for Africa, because we're all human beings. And if we're all human beings, we're thinking survival of the fittest. How do I get the best for me and my family? And if you're in a world where in a certain place, things are just easier and there are more services, naturally, people would be attracted to the West. And these are the pull factors that draw migrants, not even just trafficked women now, but migrants in general, to Europe. So having highlighted that, let's look at the push factors. I'm conscious of the time that I have. I don't have too much time. So if we look at the push factors, I think what's very interesting about Africa is its own culture and its own tradition. And when we think of African juju, which is the first push factor I will look at, it plays a very important role, because when I was going through the work, that's the body of literature that exists, I see that there's a lot of disbelief when it comes to like the level of coercion that can happen from juju. And juju is like, it's black magic, but it has very strong holds in Africa, well, I would say in Nigeria, particularly in Edo State, where majority of the victims come from. I am from Edo State myself, so I know how much people in Edo State believe in the power of black magic and the presence of supernatural powers. So it's a typical thing that when traffickers are getting their victims abroad, before they travel, they make them take oaths. And these are juju oaths. So I will just literally read to you now an expert of an oath that one of our victim participants undertook. If you just give me a minute. Okay, there I am.
Sharon, would you put the presentation on full screen for people, please?
Okay. It's not that easy because this keeps interrupting me. Slideshow. Okay, better?
Yeah, that's better, yeah.
Okay. So I found one. So she says, he called me out at night and asked me to strip naked. He watched me as I took off my clothes and gave me a white dress to put on. And he started saying things, incantations. I don't know what I drank. He gave me the contents of a calabash to drink. Another victim says, in the course of her own juju ritual, the native doctor caught the center of a live chicken. He took out the heart of the chicken and gave me to eat. How can I forget it? How can anybody forget gruesome, like, it's even me reading it, it's very traumatizing just hearing it. And imagine experiencing that. Even that as well, psychologically, can serve as a deterrent. So once these Nigerian women undergo these oaths, they are more willing to cooperate with the coercion to do the bidding of their traffickers. They are more, what's the word? They are better candidates for exploitations after this oath. Poverty. I think there is no, the issue of poverty in Africa has been over flooded. There's no point going into statistics or saying, I think, especially if we work in the not-for-profit sector, we know that a good majority of Africans are living below $2 a day. And in that perspective of poverty, once human trafficking, the thing is, it's not necessarily painted to a lot of victims as human trafficking, because from our interview with victims, we can see that a lot of these opportunities came to them as an opportunity, not necessarily as exploitation. And from that poor background, they are more susceptible to being trafficked. Again, illiteracy. In the absence of strong education that some of us might have, we might be thinking, okay, if someone says to me, please come to Ireland, I would sponsor your travel, I would sponsor your visa for you to have a better life, I would give you a job, and then you might have to pay me. Just because we might have read so much about human trafficking, we might be able to identify, there might be exploitation. I am being taken out of my comfort zone, out of my family, out of my safe place with an unknown stranger. But because someone might be illiterate, these things might not occur to them. And the illiteracy, the level of illiteracy that exists is part of the things that foil the trafficking industry. And illiterate, poor girls are often targets, according to statistics, of the traffickers. Then there is the gender inequality. There is an alarming level of gender-based violence. There's rape. There is female genital mutilation, practiced often in Edo State as well. There is domestic violence, which has to an extent lost its shock value in that culture. And once Against that background of gender inequality, a lot of women seek to escape. And especially in Edo States, there is a culture because of how rampant human trafficking has become. There is an understanding that a lot of girls are leaving the community and going abroad to fend for their families. And if this is the case, this is some form of empowerment for these women. And so going to Europe forms some form of escape route from the level of gender inequality that exists in their environment. And then I think I've taken gender-based violence as well. There is familial crisis and morality crisis, which I will take together. So when I was doing a lot of this research, not just the literature review, but we're able to speak with an official from the National Agency for the Prohibition of Human Trafficking in Nigeria, which is the main body for tackling human trafficking in Nigeria. He also highlighted that a majority of the victims come from Edo State. And in that region, there seems to be a very high level of teenage pregnancies, of polygamy. And in light of the poverty that exists there, once there are that many babies in a family, once there are that many mouths to feed, the extent of poverty, as highlighted before, makes it difficult for everyone in that family to be properly catered for. And once people are impoverished, there is desperation. Poverty breeds a level of desperation that makes them more susceptible, that makes even the family members willing to be naive. Because there is naivety, but then there's also a willingness to indulge such naivety to believe that there are actually there's actually going to be a good life for their child, and consequently a good life for their family members by sending this person abroad. And when it comes to the morality crisis, I think, and especially this is very much expounded in the research, but there's now a mix of Christianity, of Islam, of traditional worship, and in that environment that's very, very much multi-religious, there doesn't seem to be much how do I explain it now? There doesn't seem to be much, like there's not much moral uprightness, would I say. And when I say moral uprightness, I mean, if you believe in what you believe in, say, for example, I live in this house and I believe in what I believe in, there's just a culture of not being able to tell someone else how to live. And in that era and in that society of just openness and spiritedness, there doesn't seem to be much shame for anyone doing whatever they choose to do to put food on their table. And there is just a survival of the fittest mentality, a poverty fighting mentality that breeds good ground for people choosing to leave and taking the way out that they see. And I think the last two are very, very important because two of the victims that I interviewed had experienced violence at the hand of Boko Haram. And it's something that is very distant, especially here in Europe, where we're just reading about reports of Boko Haram, but we're not necessarily experiencing it. But then, for example, one of our victims who took part explained how her parents and her brother were in church. And while they were in church, there was a bomb blast to their church. And she lost those three key members of her family. And it was from there that the level of poverty in her life deepened to the level where she was desperate enough and gullible enough to be excited by the prospects provided, or easily deceived, would I say, by a trafficker. Also, police corruption. Now, I think if for stakeholders who are in the industry, in the human trafficking industry, we know that Nigeria, especially for years now, have held the majority position in relation to country of origin. But then the fight against it from that front is constantly being thwarted by corrupt police who evidence suggests actually assist, well, not all of them, some corrupt officials assist gang members, members who are in the chain of human trafficking, to evade justice. And against that backdrop, it is just very, very difficult from that end, from that African end, to effectively prevent the trafficking. So we see that our work is cut out with us, when it comes to the synthesis of push and pull factors from an African perspective. And I just wanted to read this. So this is GIFT. Well, it's not really GIFT because we have anonymized all our participants. But then one of our participants did share this quote, and it says, "I've suffered so much in this life. For someone to say she can help me. She said I would be working in a restaurant to make money to pay her back for helping me arrange my travel. And I was happy." And I think that this quote effectively just sets the background as to somebody who has been exposed to the hardship of the push factors that we looked at earlier, to be willing to accept offers from a trafficker, and even happy to accept the offer of a better life. Now we look at the impact of human trafficking on women. Sexually transmitted disease / infections. In the relationship of control that exists between the trafficker and the victim, a lot of the time, safe sex is not an option. Because in the middle of the violence that's been exerted by the customer to the victim, which is often the case, the victims are not in a position to insist on a condom being worn, for example. And as a result, there are a lot of diseases that are obviously that the victims are obviously at risk of contacting. Also, violence and the risk of violence. One very popular risk of violence that's used, especially against African women, is the threat to family members. Now, as I explained earlier, in a place like Edo State, where there is a strong culture of people, of women going abroad to help their family members, these traffickers, these people who help girls go abroad, are often known by the community members. And this means that this person who is a trafficker is known to her family. So when a threat is being made to a woman who is being trafficked that I will hurt your family, it's a very literal threat because they know where you live. They know where your mom, your dad, your grandmother lives. And so the actions that you undertake here in Europe would affect your own family members. And this is a form of control that is exerted on women and also has negative effects on their physical bodies. Torture. One of our victims.
Sharon, please. You have 3 minutes, please, Sharon.
Okay. Torture and consumption of hard drugs, I just look at them together. But when there is a lot of violence, and some violence can amount to torture and some may not. But in that situation where there is torture and there's hard drugs that's been taken in or that's been forced down their throats, women who go through trafficking, essentially, all I'm saying here is that they are at risk of these things. And I might just skip and go to more, well, not more, but key things as well. Okay, we'll briefly look at the situation in Ireland and the national plan to combat trafficking. So firstly, a victim of trafficking can report that she has been trafficked to the local Garda, or if spotted by the border control or NGOs, even a concerned citizen like you and me can refer a potential victim. However, it is only the Garda that can identify a potential victim as a suspected victim of trafficking. And once that person is identified, they are then eligible to some support. So they are eligible to support for healthcare, legal care, accommodation, and immigration arrangements. And these support structures are very much explained in the research. There are a framework of domestic regulations as well as international laws surrounding trafficking in Ireland. So essentially, we see that the state of Ireland has taken an anti-trafficking stance and there is an existing system. But then when it comes to African women, there are certain challenges. And that is, the first one is the role of the Gardaí as the people, as the ones who get to identify who a victim is. Because there is a dichotomy. The Garda are the prosecutors of crime. But at the same time, they are kept as the barrier, the gate to access victim support, because they are the only ones that can identify a victim. And in this comes a crisis, because there is a potential crime of illegal migration involved in the trafficking of an African woman who has migrated to Ireland, which might sometimes be under suspicious circumstances. And then there's that dichotomy of identifying and prosecuting this crime, as well as being able to identify this person as a victim of support, thereby entitled to victim support, victim-led approach against, and also this person being a witness towards an investigation against trafficking. And it is because of this dichotomy, I believe, and actually a lot of stakeholders believe, that there's not as many victims of trafficking being identified, because there is this dichotomy with the Gardaí. Also, another challenge is the witness as the victim. With human trafficking being as an on the ground crime as it is, it only makes sense that the victim is a witness to be able to tell her story, because in a way only she would be able to know the ins and outs of her stories. But then there are also problems that come with this, especially for African women. And the first, and I think the most obvious, is the language barrier. While some African women might be able to speak good English, not all of them can. And this would affect the extent to which they will be able to share their stories in a way that is convincing enough, or not even convincing enough, but seems reasonable to be able to meet the threshold of being a suspected victim. Also, a lot of African women have fear of the authorities. And one of the victims that we consulted with in the course of this research shared her experience. She had traveled from Nigeria to Italy to Germany and then to Ireland. But in Germany, she said that the police there were often the ones who came to deport people home. So there was a general fear while she was in Germany of the police that made her not to be able to speak to the Gardaí. And in our conversation, I said to her, please, you might need to speak to the Gardaí because you need access to the support services. And she says, I can't, I simply can't. Maybe another day, but I can't. And so we see that there is, especially with women who have traveled, who are migrant women, this might be an issue. I might skip the rest of these because I'm running out of time. But
yeah, please wrap up there. Wrap up, please. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last dilemma is the accommodation dilemma. Our research, so AkiDwA's research in 2009 still remains very relevant in relation to the treatment of women, African women in direct provision centers. There is need for gender-specific accommodation. This cannot be overemphasized, especially because women who are victims of gender-based violence have experienced violence often at the hands of men. And this housing with men is very for re-traumatization for these women. And there's a need for them to have privacy and to be secured in a place where they will have security and access to service with which they can rehabilitate. And this is not the present case. In fact, one of our victims whom we interviewed expressly said that she couldn't even speak to me properly to give me the interview over the phone because she was in a room with 4 people and had to wait for them to leave to be able to talk to me. And this is how she struggles to take her counseling as well. So we see that there is a need for better accommodation. So we finally got in here to recommendations. I might just touch on a few. We've already said that there's a need for
that would be good, yeah, so that you can cover up because she won't need to go.
Okay, just bear with me 2 minutes and I'll be done in 2 minutes. So we need a codification. So all these things that I explained before as to the National Action Plan, they exist, but they're only administrative documents. There's no law. providing for victim support. And so a victim doesn't actually. So there is a need to have these things legislated to improve the rights of victims. I might leave it that way. I might not go into all of them, but please
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
through the research. It's available on our website. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. And sorry for cutting you short. These slides will be available on our website, actually. And we are also going to email them to people. The whole report will be on the website. I want to invite Siobhan. I won't even comment in some of the things that Sharon has said. Maybe I'll do that at the end. But we have Siobhan, who actually is going to leave very shortly. So I would really like to invite her. Siobhan, we are lucky to have you this afternoon. She was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Person in 2019. She's the director for the Center of Human Rights in National University Galway. I won't actually go to the whole of her bio, but I'll invite her because I know she has another engagement in a few minutes. Siobhan, you're very much welcome, and thank you.
Thank you very much to Salome. Thank you to Katie for organizing this, and thank you very much to Sharon for such a comprehensive presentation. And I look forward to receiving the slides and hopefully following up on the work as well. Just to say, my appointment as Special Rapporteur is just since August 2020. And I mentioned that because I am quite new in the role. But I think a few things, and it was really good to have such a detailed presentation on all of the key points, I think, that are very relevant to Ireland's work in relation to human trafficking. And I think it's critically important to highlight the gender dimension, but also specifically the experience of migrant women, and in particular migrant African women in Ireland, to highlight the intersections of gender, of racism, of migration status, and how all of those feed into the context where we see ongoing in Ireland a situation where we have such impunity in relation to human trafficking, and also gaps in relation to identification and referral for assistance and protection. And I think hopefully there'll be more time, and I hope to rejoin later, but to really engage with the recommendations that were presented there and that have been highlighted by Sharon in the research and report. Just to note, in relation to the work of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, there are a number of key areas. These have been highlighted specifically also in relation to Ireland by the Council of Europe group of experts on action against trafficking. They will be doing another review of Ireland very shortly. And also in relation to Ireland's engagement with the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination, and Salome led Ireland's presentation to the third committee in December of last year. And what a key outcome from that, I think, has been the designation of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission as a national rapporteur on trafficking. So hopefully this kind of really groundbreaking empirical work that has been done by AkiDwA can feed into that work and try to really strengthen advocacy on the ground. As many of you will know, I'm sure on the call, Ireland has been designated as a Tier 2 watch under the US State Department Trafficking in Persons report this year, which is highly unusual for a European country. The only other European country is Romania. But it really highlights, I think, some critical concerns around quite urgent reforms that are needed in relation to prevention and protection, as well as prosecution and combating impunity. Specifically in relation to prevention, as was highlighted in the presentation, and actually the former UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking visited Nigeria and carried out a country visit, and there is quite a comprehensive country report available, which highlights the intersections of discrimination on grounds of gender, specific consequences in relation to conflict and forced displacement, including in the northern Nigeria region and more broadly in Edo State, and the consequences of poverty linked with discrimination on grounds of gender. So Nigeria is recognized as a very significant country of origin, but much more work needs to be done to ensure effective prevention mechanisms. In relation to Ireland as a country of destination, then I would say, and this has been highlighted in the presentation, significant gaps in relation to identification at an early stage and referral for protection. An identification of victims of trafficking or potential victims is critical so that legal aid can kick in at an early stage, so that the support services, counselling, specialised support services and assistance can kick in to prevent trafficking occurring in Ireland on arrival and re-trafficking, because we know that many women and girls experience trafficking en route and at the point of recruitment, also in the country of origin. But we need to do much more here to ensure that there is much more proactive identification, that it does not rest entirely in the hands of law enforcement authorities because of the potential conflicts of interest in relation to immigration control and management, but also because of the difficulties that can arise in building relationships of trust, in particular if somebody is arriving in a situation where they are deeply traumatized, have experienced sexual violence en route, including trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and may come from a situation where there is a distrust of authorities, including law enforcement and police. So while law enforcement bodies have a key role in relation to combating impunity, what the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, Council of Europe and others have recommended is the importance of a multi-agency approach that brings in civil society, support services, organisations like AkiDwA and others to assist in identification and referral for protection at an early stage, and to ensure that specialised support services are made available. And unfortunately, that, although it has been recommended for several years now, is not yet happening. But we are seeing, I think, momentum towards reform and change. And I hope that AkiDwA and others can continue to support that process. The second thing I want to just comment specifically in relation to Ireland is concerning assistance for victims of trafficking and obligations with regard to accommodation. And here again, it has been repeatedly highlighted that Ireland is not in compliance with its international and European legal obligations concerning the provision of specialised support and accommodation, that victims of trafficking and potential victims should not be accommodated within the direct provision system, that does not provide sufficient support. It's not a trauma-informed approach. It doesn't also provide effective protection against continuing exploitation and the risks of re-trafficking in Ireland. So again, that really needs to be addressed very urgently. While more broadly, of course, AkiDwA and others would advocate for comprehensive reform and an end to direct provision as we currently know it. And I think that is increasingly being accepted at a policy and government level. Quite clearly in relation to victims of trafficking and the risks of re-trafficking in Ireland, this system is not fit for purpose and it doesn't comply with Ireland's human rights obligations to victims of trafficking. And finally, I want to note the importance of long-term assistance and long-term social protection and effective protection beyond short-term measures. Now, too often we see that assistance and the provision of assistance is conditional on cooperation in criminal proceedings, but also there is a concern that resources are provided on a very short-term basis for assistance and protection. And really to assist in recovery and recovery from trauma over a longer term, we need long-term attention to what is required to ensure that those who are survivors of trafficking don't fall again into situations of exploitation where they are at risk. So really attention to long-term social protection, access to employment, education, and specialized supports are critical. And we really need much more attention to the resources required for that, including specialized support services and supports from NGOs, from civil society, and from others. And linked to that is the question around migration status. ensuring long-term resident status, safe migration status, and access to asylum or other complementary forms of protection, subsidiary protection, for example, in the Irish context. And there is a concern that victims of trafficking are sometimes not believed. The questions around credibility, understanding the subtle forms of coercion, understanding what happens in relation to experiences of juju, for example, as Sharon highlighted in her presentation. We need a much more in-depth understanding of the experiences of victims of trafficking in countries of origin and also en route, and a recognition of what can happen on return, where we have forced returns, where we have risks of trafficking and re-trafficking on return linked to stigma, discrimination, isolation, and experiences of poverty. And that has not been understood, not just in Ireland, but much more widely. So I think this research is really critical in highlighting and providing an evidence base in relation to these experiences. And I hope it will have an impact to bring about changes in policy and legislation in Ireland. Unfortunately, I have to step out because I have to attend another meeting. So I'm sorry about that, but I hope if the webinar is continuing that I'll be able to step back in later. But thank you again. Thank you, Salome.
Thank you very much, Siobhan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Siobhan. I know Siobhan is actually leaving. Maybe she'll be able to join us at 4. I don't know whether, because we have some questions anyway, maybe when you come back, or do you want to take even one now before you leave? Do you have a minute, or you prefer coming back?
I'll take one question, but the meeting is actually started, but yeah, please. The question is in relation to...
You are muted, Steve. Steve, you're muted.
Yes, there's a question there on if there's any available data where Ireland does the disclosures from the victims of trafficking, and what services are they, and is there training provided to the staff that do use these services, or provide these services?
Which services specifically? Is it
it's the victims, like supporting victims of trafficking, and so one of the participants is asking if there is any training that is provided to the service providers, to handle these issues.
Yes, I mean, I probably Sharon and Nusha, Salome and Katie and others can answer this as well. Obviously, the Immigrant Council does a huge amount of work. Sexual Violence Centre Cork, MECPATS is doing a lot of work and training in relation to children and child trafficking. Ruhama does ongoing training, and others. So I think there is quite a bit happening there, but it needs to continue, I think. And I'm sorry, I'm afraid I do have to step out. And thank you very much to Salome, Katie, and to Sharon, and to the other panelists. And I hope to be able to rejoin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And we will have you later for sure. I know we'll have you later.
Thank you.
As we actually continue to discuss on this area of trafficking, because as you can see, trafficking, there are people and organizations working on trafficking for a while now here in Ireland. This week, there was a research that was launched by UCD, which is also very good. We can actually link that into our website at the same time. But I think Sharon's presentation and the recommendation that she has, in particular for AkiDwA itself and for the country, is to really take into account all these things that she's raising up. And Siobhan has also raised them again. We are also in a better time now, because we are talking about abolishing direct provision. We are talking about coming up with new ways of working and new measures to be put into place. And women-only accommodation, which we asked back in 2010 for women who have experienced gender-specific harm, including trafficking, is actually one of the key elements that has been looked into the new new structure that is going to be built in terms of the state provision on people who are seeking international protection. So hopefully this can come into account. It's also actually sad that most of the women even up to now are not believed even when they tell about their stories, which shows that we have a lot of work to do, and the importance of organizations and the state working together to be able to support the woman who actually not only faces the stigma, but also the many challenges, including psychological and trauma that they actually carry along. Last year, we actually were contacted as an organization to intervene in a case of a woman. She was an African woman who was here. She was actually in prostitution, and she had moved from one county to another. Nobody who knew her. It seems there's nobody who knew her. And unfortunately, she was moved around, for sexual exploitation within the country, from Limerick to Dublin to Letterkenny. And she was found dead 11 days later. And it's very, very sad, for the family and even for people like us who did not know her, that we had to pick those pieces. So trafficking is real. We have actually seen it in our organization in a bad way. We don't voice a lot on what we do, but there's quite a lot happening with migrant women. And most of the time people are fearful of speaking out or saying things. So we've first of all finished with the first part of trafficking. We are going to come back into it. But as I said earlier, today we are talking about trafficking because it's an area of interest for our organization, and in particular, we are looking at the trafficking of African women, as you've heard. But the next speaker that we are going to have is going to focus on still sexual and gender-based violence, but on the area of forced marriages. And just to start with just small quote that I have for you here. Did you know 37,000 girls under the age of 18 are married off every day? And yes, it's happening here in Ireland. I just give you a scenario. Imagine stand 14 from school in Estonia. Your parent calls you for a family meeting to tell you they have found a fiancé for you in Middle East. And you're presented with a photo of the 26-year-old fiancé. You share the news with your close friends in school and laugh about it. In due course, your parents prepare for flight and travel arrangement, and you're taken to meet and marry your fiancé, whom you've only seen in the photo. 2 years later, you are married to this man now, and at 16 years old, have 2 children. This is actually what exactly happened with one young girl in our country here in Ireland. We've been receiving queries and a lot of questions, people want to know on what they can do when they get cases like these ones, because they are becoming very common in marriages being arranged. And we've been trying to explore how we can work better on this area, and also how to support these women house. And in next year, AkiDwA will be undertaking research on this area to be able to inform our work more. And we hope actually to work on this area of forced marriages based on what is happening in Ireland. Working at learning from organization in UK, and in the previous years, we've worked with the Southall Black Sisters who are in UK. The Southall Black Sisters was originally established in order to provide a focus for struggle of Asian women in the fight against racism, but became increasingly involved in defending human rights of Asian women who are the victims of domestic violence, and in campaigning against religious fundamentalism. This afternoon, we are very lucky to have Hanana. She's the head of policy, research, and fundraising with Southall Black Sisters. Hanana has written numerous publications on violence against minority ethnic women, and consult on policy and research for organization. So I welcome Hanana actually to address us this afternoon and to give us some information on this area. Thank you, Hanana, and you're welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Just want to say my job description has changed a bit to, well, I'm focusing a lot more on policy and research now. I've been at Southall Black Sisters for about 35 years now. And the Southall Black Sisters itself was set up in 1979, so it's 40 years old. It runs a resource center for Black and minority women across the UK, but the large majority are from the local area in West London. We deal with, yes, about 7,500 cases and inquiries on domestic and sexual violence, as well as harmful practices like forced marriage and honor-based violence and dowry abuse. Southall Black Sisters, just want to give you kind of historical context. In the early 1980s, in the 1980s, when I joined, it was very much campaigning around domestic violence within South Asian communities, primarily because we were located in Southall, which has a very large Asian population. And we were raising issues of domestic violence, but also issues around shame and honor, which are very strong cultural traditions within Asian and other minority communities, which confine women's lives, that constrains their sexual behavior, their sexuality, and their autonomy, because the honor, the honor of the family and the extended community itself is reflected in women's behavior. And women either find themselves that they're either locked in abusive situations because they're frightened of leaving and then bringing shame and dishonor onto the family, or they may be subjected to harassment and abuse in the name of honor in what is known, as so-called honor killings or honor-based violence. Over the years, we've done a lot of cases around domestic homicide and suicide, which are driven by domestic violence and notions of honor and shame. But it wasn't until the late 1990s that we got, more response from the state in terms of government response to these issues. I mean, I think in the early 1990s, we did a famous case of Kiran Jadalawala, who was an Asian woman who killed her husband after 10 years of domestic violence, and we campaigned for her release, which we successfully campaigned for her release and changed the law on provocation in the UK. But what that case also did was to raise the profile of domestic violence and propelled it onto the national agenda, particularly in terms of how the dynamics of domestic violence within Asian communities was also highlighted. But we didn't get a very positive response from the state around issues around domestic violence within minority communities till the late 1990s, when there was a change of government. New Labour had come into power, and there was we had been lobbying governments for a long time of both administrations, but it wasn't until Labour came into power that we had a new junior Home Office minister called Mike O'Brien. And we've been working with him for many years around immigration and domestic violence rules, laws, as well as talking to him about things like forced marriage. So when he came into power, he not only changed the immigration rules so that victims of domestic violence who are on spousal visas were able to stay in the country, but he also set up the first Home Office working group on forced marriage. And this was in the wake of the death of Rukhsana Naz, who was a young Asian woman who'd been killed in Derby by her mother and brother. They were angry with her because she were accused of bringing shame and dishonor for leaving her husband and then getting pregnant to her lover. She had been forced into marriage. And this conviction really raised the profile of forced marriage in a way that had never been discussed by the media or the general public before. And I think that was the result of years of campaigning around these issues by Southall Black Sisters and other Black and minority women's organizations who've been raising the issues in their own communities. What was really important about the Home Office Working Group in Forced Marriage, I was one of the members on the working group, was that what Mike O'Brien said when he set it up, he said that multicultural sensitivities are no excuse for moral blindness. Essentially, what he was saying that we have to intervene in minority communities in order to protect vulnerable groups such as women who are subject to gender-based violence. Prior to that, under multicultural thinking, the multicultural politics of the time was that there was an expectation that outside society or the state would not intervene in minority communities who seemed to be self-policing or self-governing. And you often found that community leaders who tended to be male, who tended to be quite conservative, community and religious leaders who were self-styled, who put themselves into power, and who argued that who supported this view that you cannot have outside interference in minority communities. They set themselves as the gatekeepers of those communities. And so often the argument was that you have to respect cultural difference, you have to be culturally sensitive, which meant if you were seen as being interfering in those communities, it could be, say, a social worker or a police officer or the government who may want to go into those communities to protect women from domestic violence or forced marriage, were often worried about being accused of being insensitive, intolerant, and even racist. So that fear of those accusations prevented a lot of outside intervention. But what Mike O'Brien did was say, well, no, we cannot be morally blind on this issue. And he advocated what he called a concept of a mature multiculturalism. So basically he was saying that in a mature society, we must intervene to protect vulnerable groups within minority cultures without being racist, without being intolerant or culturally insensitive. That both those things could be, that we could protect, we could fight racism and sexism at the same time, without, undermining good community or race relations. So that, we welcome that because that was the first time that the state has supported a lot of our demands. And what came out of that working group was, a lot of initiatives around forced marriage initially, and then later on around honor-based violence, which were also centered around tragic cases of women who've been killed in honor killings. One of the significant developments was the establishment of the government's forced marriage unit, which is a joint Home Office and Foreign Office unit. And the aim of that unit is not only to help British nationals or dual nationals who are taken abroad and forced into marriage there, but also to deal with forced marriage in the UK, to prevent it as well as to handle it and to help victims to escape. Now, the forced marriage unit is, it's been a very significant development. It does a lot of good work. Before that, we had a lot of problems with cases around forced marriage. We often find that the Foreign Office wouldn't go and rescue women who were taken abroad, imprisoned there, forced into marriage there. The most that they would say is, well, if she can come to the embassy, then we can help her and help her to return to the UK. But a lot of the women can't get there. They're imprisoned, they're abused, they're controlled, and therefore, they don't have resources to get to the embassy. And also the other thing that they would often say, well, she's a dual national, therefore she's not a British national, not a full British national, and therefore we cannot intervene, particularly if the country of her other nationality objects in any way. And usually these were excuses. And I think we did a lot of campaigning in trying to change their approach to cases of forced marriage, international cases of forced marriage, which did eventually happen, but it meant for a long time we've had to conduct our own casework overseas. We have to go and rescue women ourselves, not necessarily travel there, but we would have to do things like contact NGOs overseas or take the case to court overseas in order to get someone released. But that was really, really difficult because you often find that there were in remote areas, that there wasn't the cooperation that we needed from the police, and there was often corruption by the police. There was a lot of collusion within the community with the police and the authorities as well around issues around forced marriage. Now, in terms of strengthening the law in the UK, so that was much about practice. It was about, practical help for victims, which was, really important. And one of the things that we did introduce was guidance for professionals, multi-agency guidance for professionals, which I also think it's really important, and that and those guidance have become statutory. That guidance is for police officers, social workers, health workers, teachers and schools and so forth, because the big problem was that either those agencies didn't know how to handle the problem, lack training, lack resources, or they didn't want to help deal with the problem because of notions around, cultural sensitivity or racism, or not wanting to put it, of saying that that the resources were not available for this kind of work. Now, the other areas of development in the UK has been around the law. In 2007, we introduced the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act. Now, that's been quite an important development because it means that you now can go into the courts in the UK and get a specific forced marriage protection order, which has extrajudicial power, which means that girls that are taken abroad, it can also be used to persuade the authorities to cooperate for women to be brought back into the UK. It's not entirely enforceable there, but it can be used to persuade, and it helps. It has helped in many cases where you can show that you've got an order in the UK. It can also prevent girls from being taken abroad. It can prevent them. They can have a passport order, which means their passport's taken away so they can't be taken overseas by their parents. And it could also mean they can stay at home whilst they, because a lot of young women and girls do not want to leave an abusive, even though it's abusive, they don't want to leave their home. They don't want to leave their parents. They don't want to, they're not used to living independently and are often frightened of doing so. So it can, although it's not perfect, it's not, it's not recommended that you stay at home, but they are able to have an order to prevent their removal from the UK. Obviously, that doesn't prevent them being forced into marriage in the UK, although an order can prevent a marriage in the UK. But they will stay, often if they stay at home, they will stay under emotional pressure. I mean, I think one of the things that people got to realize about forced marriage is that it is duress. It's, its definitions. We've had to, over the years, to clarify the definition of what it means. And, it is it's marriage where there is lack of valid and free consent and where there is duress involved. But the duress is not always necessarily physical duress, although that can be involved. And other things like abduction and deception and so forth can be involved. But also, emotional blackmail, the emotional and social expectation or cultural expectation to get married, to have an arranged marriage, to have a sense of duty to your family or to your community or to your culture. And that may also amount to a form of duress because it's mental and psychological pressure. Now, the law itself has not defined forced marriage more fully until the criminalization of forced marriage, which took place in 2014. Now, under that law, it talks about aiding and abetting. It talks about how consent can, if there's lack of mental capacity, consent cannot be given. And obviously, all throughout all of this, if you're a minor, consent cannot be given. And there are, been some cases of women or girls who are minor may have been forced to marriage, not necessarily in the UK, but they may be taken abroad. And that is one dimension of the cases deal with those that take place in the UK. So a lot of the time you're trying to prevent a forced marriage if you can. You're trying to prevent someone from going overseas if they're worried about a forced marriage or suspect a forced marriage. Again, that is part of the work. If they are taken abroad, then arrange for them to come back into the UK if possible. And that's if anybody knows that they've been taken abroad. So again, it's a question of relying on someone who will report them. Sometimes you get a boyfriend or a partner, and sometimes you even get a relative who might report it or try to seek help from it. But some professionals are in key positions to notice problems, like teachers, for example, and doctors and so forth are often in key positions and know in advance when that there may be a suspected forced marriage, even before the victim themselves reports it. And The other dimension around forced marriage is, of course, there are also women and girls who may be brought in from overseas and then experience forced marriage in the UK. So these are migrant women who will have insecure immigration status in most cases, and who will therefore be trapped within a situation where they may be subject to deportation if they leave that if they leave that family or their partner, um, and also have no recourse to public funds, which means that they can't claim most forms of social security benefits or council housing. So there is a fear of both destitution and deportation if they leave because they have insecure immigration status. Now, most of those cases that we deal with are women who are in genuine marriages but then experience domestic violence. But in some cases, there are women who are facing forced marriage and who've been forced into marriage, and then also then find themselves trapped in that marriage in the UK because they do not or cannot go back to their country of origin, or they cannot leave because they're economically dependent on the violent family or a husband that they marry. Now, in the UK, that we have made some reforms around immigration law. That means that women who are on spousal visas or partner visas can stay in the UK if they can prove domestic violence, and they can also claim benefits under the Destitution and Domestic Violence Concession um, if they are going to make an application as a victim of domestic violence to stay in the UK. But that reform does not, I mean, it took us 20 years to get that reform, but that still does not cover women who are non-spousal visas. So those who may have come in on other visas or who may be undocumented. Now, they obviously cannot apply under the domestic violence rule for spousal visas to stay in the UK. They may be able to make other types of application for asylum, for example, but they also have no recourse to public funds in most cases. And that has not changed. And that is one of the big battlegrounds for us at the moment. And we are now trying to get an amendment through the current domestic abuse bill that's going through Parliament, so that women who are on non-spousal visas are able to get access to benefits and housing hopefully whilst they regularize their status. And then the other problem is just getting to regularize the status. If you're not on a spousal visa and you can't show domestic violence, and you could argue forced marriage within it, but again, that may be seen as not a genuine marriage. So you're kind of in a situation where you might be seen as being involved in a sham marriage, but there's a difference between a sham marriage and a forced marriage. And a sham marriage is where both parties are trying to deceive the system. But in a forced marriage where one or both parties may be a victim of forced marriage, and the intention behind it is not to have some kind of temporary marriage. The intention usually around forced marriage is to have a marriage, so to have a long-term relationship, even though one or both parties might have been forced into it. The intentions are different. No, but that has raised debates around the use of immigration laws in the UK around how far can you handle or tackle forced marriage by using immigration laws, because some cases are women who are taken abroad and then are forced to not only marry but also to sponsor their husbands into the UK. Now, we've been against the use of immigration laws to tackle forced marriage because we don't think that most marriages that take place overseas are genuine, but also there isn't enough evidence to show that that by introducing immigration laws that they will tackle the problem of forced marriage, because usually women and girls are forced into marriage because there's an attempt to control their sexuality and their autonomy through the practice of forced marriage, and it has kind of very strong cultural and religious justifications around it in many communities. And therefore, we argued, I mean, the government introduced a law which said, initially they introduced a law that you couldn't bring your overseas partner unless you were both 18. Although, you know, in the UK, you can get married at 16, but with parental consent. So at 18, you can get married without parental consent. And then they changed that law to increase it to 21. So basically, they were saying that you have to be, both parties had to be 21 before you could have someone coming in from overseas as your spouse. And we challenged that. We legally challenged that. We went. There was a case that we intervened in called oh God, can't remember. Quiller and Beebe case, which we said that, you know, increasing the law to to the age of 21 was discriminatory, was racially discriminatory, and it was, you know, the case was taken to court by a couple who wanted to be together, who were under 21, and therefore couldn't be together until, you know, both parties were 21, and that they had a genuine marriage. So so we argued that, you know, this is discriminatory, it's racially discriminatory because it is discriminated against family reunion in migrant communities. And
Can you please wrap up, Hanana, please?
Sorry?
You wrap up, please.
Okay. So I'm just saying that, you know, we won that case, so that the law was changed. So in terms of where we are now, I think our concerns now is that is the implementation. A lot of good, I mean, there's been a lot of controversy around the criminalization of forced marriage because there's a fear that the criminalization has driven the problem underground. There's only been 3 convictions on the law of forced marriage. It's the implementation, the effective implementation of the law and guidance is the problem now. You know, in 2015, the Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary did an investigation into forced marriage and honor-based violence and found that the police response to domestic violence was still very poor. So the guidance is not working. There's a very low rate of charging and conviction around forced marriage and honor-based violence. So therefore, there's an issue around implementation and effective implementation. The other issue is there is now a campaign to increase the age of consent to the age of 18 to prevent child marriage at the age of 16 to 70. So that's still going through Parliament. The other problem, I think, is that we've also seen a rise of religious fundamentalism or very strong religious identities in our own communities, which is increasing control over women's lives. And what we're finding that forced marriage doesn't have to be, you know, a legal marriage. It can be a religious marriage. It can be a marriage that takes place within the community that is conducted, you know, by religious leaders and priests and so forth, and mosques and so forth. And also divorce can be obtained through what's known as religious tribunals or Sharia councils, which are increasingly also trying to encroach into issues around forced marriage. So if a woman complains of a forced marriage, they're being diverted into using religious tribunals rather than using the civil and criminal justice system. And finally, I just want to say that it's really important for us to have services. The women's organizations like South of Black Sisters are historically underfunded, but now we increasingly face closure. COVID-19, the pandemic, the current recession, even Brexit will mean that we'll have less funding coming into the UK from the EU, which means that women's organizations like ourselves are not going to be able to survive. And yet we're on the front line. We're on the front line of providing services to victims, but also in terms of challenging the community, challenging religious and cultural pressures that women experience within those communities, as well as the state, to get the state to intervene to protect women from all communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanana. And we still have so much to run, for example, from South Hall Black Sisters. And, we'll continue actually to contact you and to see how much help we can get from you in understanding this issue. But as well, we've heard very clearly from you how the UK government set up a working look into this issue. Every time we say migration is new in Ireland, so hopefully there will be one day a working group looking into this area and also in the area of trafficking like we spoke earlier. But thank you so much for your input to us this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be linking with you up again. We are going actually to work on this area more, so if anybody out there who is listening is interested on the area of forced marriages, please link up with AkiDwA. We have provided our website there, you can see. Before we move to the plenary, I want to ask Steve very quickly to pose some questions, just 2 questions or so to Hanana and Sharon before we move to the plenary. You are muted, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Salome. I think mostly from what I'm seeing I'll start with Hanana's presentation. Most of the people that have been commenting here are aware of Hanan's work, and most of them have given very good review and have just given a bit of some nice tributes to the organization. But of interest, Hanana, there is one question there that I think I found it interesting is, can you say some of the specific measures you've taken to ensure a service response to violence while protecting the community from stigma, stereotyping, racism, and whatever, as selective culturalization? So that's a very, very deep and very heavy-laden question. Maybe I've already forwarded this to you, so you might respond to that. And for Sharon, I think I've forwarded some of the questions, but of interest is people are really asking, how come there is a lot of Nigerians, and they're asking, is the question not that there is so many other Africans, and why is it that it is only prevalent to the trafficking of Nigerian women? So you probably might respond, or you have responded in your presentation, but you can give a quick synopsis of that.
Do you want me to respond first?
Yeah, no problem.
So I think we, as an organization, have always worked around intersectional discrimination. We've always seen the intersection between race and gender. So we know that if we talk about things like forced marriage, that it may, that this could be used by racists to take forward their agenda about minority communities by, taking away rights, or to harass them, or impose immigration controls, or whatever. And I think we've always tried to make sure that we're trying to address both issues simultaneously. And so practically, the way we're trying to deal with that is using the human rights framework, saying that no form of inequality is acceptable, that all of it has to be addressed simultaneously. One cannot be done at the expense of the other. The other thing is that we've had to link our struggles with the wider feminist movement, to say, well, domestic violence, for example, takes place in all communities. And culture can be used in those communities as well to control women. The notion of women as property is something that is shared in a lot of patriarchal societies. When we were campaigning around Kirin Jizalawale, she wasn't the only woman who was in prison for killing her husband. There were lots of women from white communities, from the majority community, that we linked up with and campaigned together to show that it wasn't just an issue that existed in Asian communities or minority communities, But also, if it is a specific issue that does affect minority communities, like forced marriage or honor-based violence, we try to make sure that the way that the state or society responds is not racist or discriminatory, because, you know, the whole thing about the Quiller and Baby case was to say, well, you cannot use immigration law in order to control forced marriage, which is based on gender inequality. And therefore, we don't want racist responses to our demands for gender equality. You know, so that is how we practically try to do it. And that's how we try to do it politically as well. I mean, we took the case to court, you know, we took the state to court for using racist immigration laws. At the same time, we're campaigning around migrant women who have insecure immigration status, who are trapped in violent marriages. So we're trying to deal with both. We're trying to handle those both. And that is intersectional feminism, actually. It's about looking at the intersection between race, gender, and other forms of inequality when you're trying to both practically deal with issues as well as politically.
Anna, Sharon, quickly.
Yeah, just in relation to why Nigeria forms majority in terms of country of origin, well, it has to be a case where there are three different reasons that I've been able to identify. One is just the sheer population. Nigeria is very, I think globally, I think it's the fourth largest now, with over 190 million. So just the numbers when we're thinking of countries from Africa. Also, it is the case that a lot of migrants that are residents in Europe are Nigerians. And because they're making a link between home countries, because I established before that there is a grooming that happens in the country of origin, it only makes sense that they are also recruiting Nigerians, because they are a good number of migrants abroad are Nigerians. Not to say that they are not interlinked with other, in terms of like the trafficking gangs, that there is a link internationally. You know, it's just when we're thinking of countries, especially countries from Africa, this is the reason why. When we look at the links of factors of impoverishedness and poverty, we see why Africa is a good target, and then why Nigeria is an easy target too. And then the next question there was in relation to, so yeah, I just read one comment. I think it's very important there, how to tackle the issue of the victims' fears of how things might relate to their families, of the threat of violence to their families. And that is in relation to offering residence to victims. Because once that is the case, then they can offer some protection to their families. Well, that's a long shot, but that's the only shot that I can come up with. Like, you know, it's a thing where policymakers have to sit down and discuss, because there is a genuine threat to families of victims.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I'm actually not going to close this part of the session now and move into the next session. We might actually have, Sharon answer some of the questions later. But to help AkiDwA facilitate the next session, I'm going actually to invite Anna Sobina. And Anna Sobina is the strategy and policy coordinator of the European Network of Migrant Women. She actually sits in so many panels, and Anna herself, I know her very well. I've worked with her. She's a great woman. And without wasting time, I'll just actually invite Anna to also invite the panelists. We are going to continue to talk about trafficking and forced marriages in our discussions, even in the next panel. Anna, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salome. Thank you, everyone, all the participants. It's an incredible turnout. I'm very happy to see this. And well done, AkiDwA, for all your work. I have to emphasize it's very reciprocal. I do think that Salome is a great woman and a great leader, and she is the co-chair of our network, and she provides great leadership for a long time now. We have now two panelists, and I'm supposed to facilitate in a way a discussion, and I was also asked to give a short introduction. This is what I'm going to do. But meanwhile, just to introduce that we're going to have Dr. Nusha Yonkova, who is a gender and anti-trafficking expert at the Immigrant Council of Ireland. I think that her title speaks for herself, the kind of work she's leading in the Immigrant Council of Ireland. But apart from this, she also is a doctor. She has a PhD that she wrote specifically on the issue of trafficking in women in the context of Ireland for sexual exploitation. So she's really the expert on this issue. And she also used to be the chair previously of our network. And also we have the pleasure to have Wanjiku Mbugua with us, who is in the UK and she is in Wales. And she's the head of regional services and the organization BOSO, with 14 years of experience of leading work and delivering services for domestic violence victims, with specific focus on Black and minority ethnic families, women and children. And she also represents organization at international level. So to introduce these two speakers, I just would like to make a general remark on the recent development that happened at the international level. And I don't know if all the participants are aware of this, but that's an important thing. CEDAW committee, the committee that overviews the implementation of the Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, they adopted the general recommendation number 38. It was published on the 6th of November. And why I'm bringing it up is because it has direct relevance to today's discussion. More so specifically for trafficking, for sexual exploitation, but also for forced marriage, because there are established links between trafficking and sexual exploitation and forced marriage. And I'm just going to read a quote from this general recommendation, and I invite everyone to take a look at this. Unfortunately, CEDAW, like a lot of instruments on women's rights, is not very well utilized, is not utilized to the extent how it should be, in my opinion. So I'm going to read what they write. The recommendation does not concern just trafficking in women and girls. It concerns trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration. Again, this makes it particularly relevant for today's discussion. So what they say trafficking and exploitation of prostitution in women and girls is unequivocally, a phenomenon rooted in the structural sex-based discrimination constituting gender-based violence, and often exacerbated in the context of displacement, migration, increased globalization, and there's a long list of exacerbating factors, including militarization, foreign occupation, armed conflict, and so on. So the reason I'm quoting this, and this is central in this recommendation, is because to our delight, as a feminist and migrant women-led organization, what does this recommendation tells us? It tells us that it recognizes very clearly trafficking in women and sexual exploitation as a form of violence against women. And this is the position that we take, and this is the kind of lens on the problem that we advocate in the network. Secondly, it also tells us that trafficking in women as such is not caused by migration. It is exacerbated, it may be exacerbated in the context of migration, and certainly in the context of conflict or poverty, but migration per se does not cause trafficking. And again, for us, it's an extremely important point, and I think that some of the issues raised previously by Hanana, in a way how they are addressing violence against women or forced marriage, by emphasizing that it has to be an intersectional approach. In the same way, we demand and expect responses to trafficking. Similarly, we do not want racist responses to trafficking. We do not want the responses that actually throw migrants out of the country. We do not want the responses that do not recognize women who were trafficked as victims and instead deporting them. And this is the crux of the dilemma that we are dealing with different types of discrimination and violence against women, where absolutely trafficking is very central, but there is domestic violence and there is forced marriage and there is honor-based violence. And you know, patriarchy is basically quite inventive, and they keep coming with different ways how to abuse and exploit women who are in the most vulnerable situation. And with this, I'm going to finish my introduction and pass the floor to Nusha first. I think she prepared some overview and presentation, and then we can have the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Oops. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, AkiDwA. I was so delighted to and accepted this opportunity to address you today with great honor. And I would like to congratulate AkiDwA, all the team, for their outstanding contribution to the well-being of migrant women in Ireland and in the European Union. Without you, the picture would have been different. Violence against migrant women stands a bit aside from the conventional understanding of violence against women. This is due to the fact that many forms of violence are relatively newly defined and recently recognized, and because they affect disproportionately and sometimes exclusively migrant women and girls. This is another reason to welcome the focus of this event that highlights violence particularly against migrant women, because this is different. In the last few years, together with other colleagues, feminists of migrant background, including Salome and Anna and all your friends probably, I'm working to break the conventional understanding of gender-based violence and violence against women, and to broaden it to include forms that are prevalent for migrant women, such as forced marriages, domestic violence with dependent immigration status, which is different from domestic violence as such, trafficking for labor organ removal and domestic servitude, and most of all, trafficking of migrant women and girls for a variety of exploitation purposes linked to their sex and to their sexual and reproductive functions, such as trafficking for prostitution, for pornography production, trafficking for forced and exploitative marriages, and I thank the previous presenter, trafficking for sale of babies, for sale of ovas, which is sale of women's eggs, and others. So today I will briefly focus on trafficking of migrant women for sexual exploitation in prostitution as the most prevalent type of exploitation. And this is also my specialization and the specialization of my organization, the Immigrant Council of Ireland and its Independent Law Center, to assist migrant women who have been exploited in prostitution, and including those who have fallen victims of trafficking crimes. Trafficking in human beings is a vast umbrella of crimes, but it is also recognized that trafficking in human beings is a form of gender-based violence, and AkiDwA already mentioned this and believes this. This is also enshrined in the Istanbul Convention and in the European Union Victims' Rights Directive. But those who work with trafficked women know that this is not sufficiently recognized in Europe and in Ireland in particular. From the outset, trafficking against women and girls was not recognized and accepted as a gender-based violence and violence against women, and it was allowed to develop separately on its own, separate from all the other forms of violence against women. That was a mistake. This led to gender-neutral, women-neutral responses, which affected and impacted negatively migrant women who were violated. As a result, the country was embarrassed by being repeatedly downgraded and downgraded, while the solution was just in front of our faces. I have prepared few presentation slides, which I would like to show you, and I'll go very quickly through them. But for these purposes, I need to share my screen. Screen share. Okay, this one. And okay, so that's this is my slide, and that's my starting slide. This is the image that we used to put on a report we launched only yesterday. And this report is dedicated to our work on assisting trafficked women. We are moving gradually away from saying assisting victims of trafficking, because what we actually do is we assist migrant women who have been trafficked to Ireland. And I'm encouraging everybody, if you have time, to go through that report, which is very topical. My next slide.
Please, Nusha, could you share it full screen, please?
Okay. Which I am doing how? New slide, blah, blah, blah. Slideshow. Okay, cool. Okay. My second slide shows a list of resources from Ireland. On the top is the report I mentioned, which was published yesterday, and which contains best practice principle in assisting migrant women in terms of legal assistance and also practical integration supports. And we believe that this will contribute to the understanding and to the highlighting of the separate and specific sets of measures that are needed for the recovery of trafficked migrant women. I'm sharing several reports that are relevant to the anti-trafficking developments in Ireland. And Siobhan Mullally mentioned earlier on the situation with victims of trafficking and their inappropriate housing in direct provision. And again, I would like to thank AkiDwA for their report. I'm saying it just now, from 2010, which was very clear. It was a very clear cry that direct provision is totally inappropriate. And who knows, by delaying our response to that report of AkiDwA, how many women we have let down. And then the third piece that I'm sharing with you is a report of the advisory group led by Professor Catherine Day, who reviewed recently direct provision and published a report just last month in October, where already a separate section on housing of victims of trafficking is included, because the previous review of direct provision failed to adequately acknowledge that direct provision is actually used for housing victims of trafficking. Not all of them apply for asylum. It is just used as a shelter for trafficked women, and it is not a shelter. But we are looking forward to a white paper that will give effect to the recommendations of this report. And I am encouraging everybody to follow how these things are developing in Ireland. The other report, Violence Against Migrant Women, I would like to thank my colleagues from AkiDwA, from Sexual Violence Center Cork, and other migrant organizations who jointly helped me to prepare this report to the Citizens Assembly, which is raising exactly the same point. Listen, migrant women are violated in a different way, just included in your general national strategy on violence against women. We should not be considered separately from the state approach. And then my second page lists several reports from the European Union. 3 of them are particularly recent. They're from last month. They are all testaments and proofs that trafficking is a form of gender-based violence. The study on data collection is very clear on how many women are affected by trafficking, and in particular trafficking for sexual exploitation. Then the second one is the study on the economic, social, and human costs of human trafficking. And these costs are immense in the realm of trafficking for sexual exploitation. This means that the costs are taking toll on migrant women in particular who are trafficking in Europe. And then there are a couple of slightly older reports, the study on gender dimension of trafficking in human beings that explains it all, from 2016, and the gender specific measures in anti-trafficking action, which I had the pleasure to work on with Anna and with other feminist researchers in Europe. Here I am including snapshots from the fact sheets that is prepared by the European Commission, explaining in very clear terms the proportion of women and girls affected by human trafficking in the European Union. 72% of all registered victims in the European Union are women and girls. Women and girls were the very vast majority of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, 92%. There are worrying statistics around children who represent 22% of the victims, and even more worrying and appalling that 64% of the victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation. And just to see proportionally what we are talking about, why are we focusing so much on trafficking for sexual exploitation? It is very clear why. Because 60% of all trafficking crimes are trafficking for the sexual exploitation in Europe. In fact, the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime in 2014 identified Europe as a continent, as a place, as a region in the world where trafficking for sexual exploitation is more prevalent. And this may not be so in other regions of the world, but in Europe, this is what we do. Trafficking for labor exploitation in comparison is only 15%. And the rest of the percentages, 200 belong to other forms of human trafficking, but the overall proportion of exploited people and victims are women and girls. I just wanted to finish with several words about Ireland, if I have time to continue. Do I have time? Sorry.
I think you have little bit of time, but very little.
Okay. So I just wanted to say in Ireland, the response to human trafficking developed in 2008 when we criminalized the crime of human trafficking. It is very important to understand that Ireland only criminalized trafficking. It did not put in law protection for victims of trafficking. So this is provided through an administrative policy that is quite outdated. It is published on the website. We don't know who maintains it, who changes it or doesn't change it, but it does not provide rights to victims of trafficking to be assisted and recognized in law. And that's a huge deficiency. This specific policy that exists on the website and means very little is called Administrative Immigration Arrangements for Protection of Victims of Trafficking. And because it is immigration arrangements, it only deals with immigration provisions. It does not apply to Irish nationals victims, to European Union nationals victims, and more notably, it does not apply to victims of trafficking who seek international protection or asylum in Ireland. All those cohorts of victims are excluded from the possibility to be identified as victims of trafficking in Ireland. I'm opening the bracket here to say that trafficking in human beings, unlike other crimes, requires special identification of victimhood. And this means that the victims are not believed easily by default or a priori. This means you cannot walk into the guard station and report that you have fallen a victim of crime. You have to be interviewed and identified. It's called identification. In Ireland, this process is super formalized, and it is delegated to very high-ranking police officers. In other countries, this is not so. And NGOs and specialized independent experts could also identify victims of trafficking. So this is a huge barrier in Ireland because the police in Ireland, as in other EU member states, experience a conflict of interest in their work. On the one hand, they have to establish whether the person has committed a crime, for example, in relation to a crime in relation to sexual offenses, migration offenses, cannabis production, you name it. And on the other hand, the police has to decide whether they themselves are victims of crime and which takes precedence. And this is extremely difficult and conflicting. For this reason, identification lasts ages and it's super unsatisfactory. Even for this small cohort of people, the undocumented third country nationals that could be in theory formally identified. So we are falling short big time on identification of victims. And that's already preconditions our failure all along. And Siobhan Mulally mentioned earlier that Ireland has been humiliated and downgraded on 2 consecutive occasions, which is super humiliating in 2018 and 2019. In those reports, it fell down to level 2 and finally to level 2 watch list. This means that we are not meeting the minimum standards to protect victims of trafficking. I would like to flag just few other negative reflections about our response to trafficking and then finish on a few positive reflections. So the other one is the unconditional assistance. Do we have unconditional assistance to victims of trafficking? No, we don't have this. We are deciding how to assist victims on the basis of what migrant status they have and what nationality they have. And this creates different cohorts and levels of assistance, and it leads to an extremely elaborate system. And we don't see victims of trafficking as human beings, first and foremost, that has experienced a crime on Irish soil in most cases and protect that victim. But no, we go into unpacking what sort of background the person has in terms of his ethnicity, identity papers, migrant status, connections with Ireland, connections with other countries, if we can ship the person back to another EU member state. So that leads to unconditional assistance. Accommodation was already referred to sufficiently. And final word to say about legal assistance and to include compensation in it. Legal assistance is exceptionally important in Ireland especially because we have such a complex system of assistance and rights. If everything was clear, if it was prescribed in law, if we had forms to tick boxes and whatever, everybody will be treated more or less in the same way. But we have this extremely complex assistance, and there is a huge difference if you have a solicitor right beside yourself to represent you and to look holistically at all the various issues you experience as a person who has fallen victim of a crime. The state is not providing this. Only the Immigrant Council of Ireland Independent Law Centre provides this. We are not funded by the state. We are constantly struggling for funding and constantly in the mode of application for new funding so that we can continue our work. And it's plainly exhausting and quite frustrating. And including the compensation of victims, the centrality of compensation of victims for the integration of victims is, I hear you, Anna, is super important. And victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are at a clear disadvantage in Ireland, but I suspect also in other countries, because the protections that we have created as a society against unlawful, fraudulent employment and exploitative employment doesn't apply to sexual exploitation, and it should not be applying, it cannot apply. But in other words, if you are exploited in the framework of labor, the employment relation tribunals and all of it are at your disposal with their solicitors and everything. If you are a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation, your avenues for compensation are extremely limited. You can only rely in court to private proceedings, to hire a solicitor to carry on private proceedings, or on a judge who would rule compensation against the perpetrator of the crime against you, provided assets are confiscated and available, which is a hugely theoretical possibility which has not happened to date. And I would like to finish on a positive sentence. Very recently, the independent national reporter has been appointed for Ireland. This means we will not be relying anymore only on Greta, Council of Europe, the US Department of State to review our work, but we will have national reporter, and this is the Irish Equality and Human Rights Commission, who will be reviewing how effective our measures and our investments in human trafficking are. And we're looking forward to see how this will work. Another positive feature to our response is the unconditional medical assistance and the medical card which is provided. And we think that we are quite special listening to other countries as to how other jurisdictions are treating especially migrant victims of crime. We also have trained police officers for interviews. On many occasions, women have reported that they're satisfied in the way they have been interviewed. And we have individual care planning, which lays with a very sort of feminist group in the HSC. And finally, and most of all, Ireland has fantastic civil society organizations and experts on human trafficking, and this is what makes the country so special. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nusha. This was excellent and very comprehensive, and I think it connected so well to the previous report presentation that Sharon did. So it's a very comprehensive picture that we have with focus on Ireland specifically. Thank you for this. And I'm going to pass the floor to Wanjiku to make her presentation about her work, her organization, what's happening in the UK and Wales. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Wanjiku Ngoga. I work for an organization called BAOZO. BAOZO is an organization that was started in 1995 in Wales. Very similar to South for Black Sisters, BAOZO was actually started to look into the needs of Black and Asian women and children, because it was felt that at the time, Black and especially Asian women who were resident in Cardiff were not presenting with any issues to do with domestic abuse. And it was felt that there could have been a barrier that was preventing them from seeking this support. So BAOZO came in existence in 1995 just to look at the needs of Asian and African women in Cardiff at the time. BAOZO has since grown, and it's now a Wales organization that is funded by the Welsh government to support victims of what we call violence against women, domestic abuse, and sexual violence in the whole of Wales. The specialist work that we do and what's included in that VALDA, we call it VALDA SP, Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse, and Sexual Violence. The specialist support includes work in regards to abuse that is very specific to Black and Asian women, and to some extent to Eastern European women who joined in as victims, clients later. This abuse, to include forced marriage, honor-based violence, female genital mutilation, was very specific to Asian and Black women. And this is what BAOZO has been doing for the last 25 years, supporting a lot of women who come into Wales and into the UK from all the countries where these particular forms of abuse are practiced. When they come into UK and into Wales, they find themselves in situations where the professionals, the statutory agencies that are there to safeguard them do not understand these issues. And it therefore becomes the role of BAOZO to support these victims. We've done some work with South for Black Sisters in the past in campaigning and lobbying, and we've added a voice, especially being in Wales and they being in England. We've added a voice to some of the campaigns, and that's how we came about what you call destitution, domestic violence concession that Hanana talked about earlier on. This is a concession that has been very useful to our women who are on a spousal visa and who face domestic abuse and are threatened with deportation because they can't stay in the country. This has helped a lot. So what does BAUSO do? As I said, we're in Wales, and I'm not saying that people don't know, but Wales is a devolved country in that we're in the UK, but some of the laws in England are very different from the laws in Wales. And that's why, especially during this COVID period, England is under lockdown now, but we are not under lockdown in Wales because we are a devolved country and some of the laws do not follow what's happening in England. So in the same way, some of the laws to do with the support that we receive from the government are very different. And so when we are lobbying for the issues to do with the migrant women that we support, sometimes we are lobbying with the Welsh government, and we're also lobbying to the Westminster government, where we're saying women coming into the UK are ending up in Wales and these are their problems. So the main role of BAUSO is to lobby and campaign for the needs of what we call Black and minority ethnic women in the UK and especially in Wales. So that's a role that we've carried on very well. And I myself, as I'm a regional manager for BAUSO in North Wales, I sit on various strategic forums where I'm representing the needs of Black and minority ethnic women. If you ever see me in a meeting, I am there to represent the needs of Black and minority ethnic women because it's very important that their needs are represented and sometimes they are overlooked. We also raise awareness within the communities because with such issues as FGM, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, honor-based violence, we find the need to speak to our communities and educate them on the law of the country. A lot of people coming to the UK, they come into Europe, carrying some cultural practices from their countries, which they deem to be right or acceptable because they're acceptable in their countries, but they do not realize that these are not allowed in the countries that they end up in. So one of the roles of BAUSO, again, is to raise awareness among the BME communities, going out to communities and saying, oh, do you realize that FGM is not allowed in this country? It's illegal. If you're caught taking your daughter to go through FGM, you'll be arrested. You go to court for it. Do you realize that forced marriage is not allowed in the country? And so we talk to communities, we go into community groups, we talk to fathers, we talk to mothers, we talk to village elders, we talk to religious leaders, just raising awareness on the need to understand about the differences in culture and what's allowed in this country, what's not allowed. We would call them citizenship classes, what we do with the people. So that's another very important role of BAUSO. As well as that, we educate professionals, as I said, with statutory statutory agencies, the local authorities, the council, the police, sometimes they do not understand the issues of Black and minority ethnic people. Social workers do not understand the issues that these women face. Sometimes people don't even understand that just because you live in the UK doesn't mean you're entitled to benefits. And because you're not entitled to benefits, you're living in poverty. And so you need help on one or the other issues. So raising awareness and educating professionals is very, very critical to our work. On the ground, we work with the victims, we support the victims. As soon as they've come to our attention, because a lot of the referrals that we get from the police and social services, health, as soon as they come to our attention, we seek to meet up with them. We try to find out what the issues are. We try to find out how they would like us to help them. So we work with the victims and in the best way possible. And in a specialist way, again, because we know if they are not entitled to benefits, we'll help them find a way of keeping safe. The most important thing is about their safety. So we help them to keep them safe. So that's, again, very important role of supporting victims. And at any time during the year, we support about 5,000 victims of domestic abuse, what I call violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence. So this covers everything. This covers domestic abuse, sexual violence, forced marriage, honor-based violence. This covers female genital mutilation. You will notice that I've not talked about human trafficking there, because human trafficking is completely different. So that's how Basel started in 1995 to work on those issues that I've talked about. As we went on, we realized that modern day slavery, as we call it here, human trafficking and exploitation is a big issue in our community, and especially among the BME people. And exactly as Sharon said, some of the issues that she mentioned there about poverty, about juju and everything, all those issues make it very, very easy for women from Black and ethnic minority groups to be victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. But one other very major issue is immigration, people's immigration status. The fact that you have not got the right to be in the country makes you very vulnerable, and people take advantage of you because they know you cannot go to the police when you don't have the right papers. So a lot of the women that in that category, they're failed asylum seekers, they're people who've come on a visitor's visa that has expired. These people find themselves in real programs. So since 2010, we've worked to support victims of modern day slavery. And towards that, we ran 3 refuges in Wales. We have a refuge for men, because we recognize that men can also be victims of modern slavery. We have 2 refuges for women in Cardiff, and we have another refuge for women victims of modern slavery here in North Wales. So within that, we support women during their journey after we've rescued them. What happens is that they complete what is called here a national referral mechanism form, and that's sent to the Home Office. Well, a woman, the minute you send that form to the Home Office and the Home Office recognizes that person as a victim of modern slavery, it means that they are protected. They cannot be deported. They cannot be taken to court for any immigration issues until their issue has been looked into, and the Home Office have decided whether they agree that this person has been trafficked. So we support them through that in the refuge. Apart from the people that we support in the refuge, we supporting people in the community. A lot of victims are still in their homes, in the community. Some of them are asylum seekers who have come into the UK via Libya and other countries where they've been trafficked or exploited. We support them because of what they've had to go through. And most of these are in their hostels or in their homes. So we support them wherever they are. So trafficking has taken a completely new form in the UK in the last few days. While listening to both Sharon and listening to Nusha and Sharon, I know you're talking about women today, but I just wanted to add on to something that is become very clear in our work here, is the trafficking or exploitation of young people in what is known as county lines, where a lot of young people are being used to peddle drugs, and because of that, they're held in captive. They owe somebody something, and because of that, they're in some form of human trafficking. Very young children, as young as 8, and a lot of them are also carrying the debt of their parents, because your parent did this and they didn't give us this money. We find in that a lot of children from Black and minority ethnic groups have been enticed to this form of county lines, because the very vulnerable, a lot of them want to fit into the community. They want to be the cool guys. So when they approach to do these things by people who they think are cool, they just join in. You know, some of them may be threatened as well, and that has become a very, very, very serious problem here. In the last 3 years, we supported over 700 children in Wales, just these children that have been put into these trafficking gang. We've also seen, because again of vulnerability and destitution, a lot of Black women, especially, starting what are pop-up brothels. they start them themselves. They think I'm going to make some money. But then along the way, somebody comes and starts to exploit them because they need protection. And somebody says, I'll protect you. But in the process, this person exploits them. So that's another trend that has become very, 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 very common here in Wales. And we've seen a few women, Black women especially, and women from Eastern European countries, because there's a gap barrier in support services for women from Eastern European countries, a lot of them being forced into this kind of sexual exploitation. The other thing I wanted to talk about is about Holyhead, the border between...
AkiDwA, I'm sorry, just to remind you, we're running short of time. We have to finish at past, and we still have to, because Siobhan joined, and I think maybe somebody wants to ask a question, and you probably will have questions for yourself.
I'll talk about Holyhead, that is the border between us and you. From here, if I was to travel from here where I am to come to Dublin, I'll come through the Holyhead port. This Holyhead port has been looked at as a real challenge for human trafficking. Ireland has always been said to have very lax immigration rules, and because of that, criminals are using that as a gateway to come to the UK. I can tell you the amount of times we've had to pick up clients from Holyhead, and how that has happened is that somebody's coming from Romania, but instead of flying straight to Heathrow, they're coming via Ireland because it's easier to come to Ireland, and then coming through Holyhead. And I've been through Holyhead many times. Sometimes they're not checks. It's a real, real worry. In 2017, there was a man from Georgia. It was actually a trafficking gang from Georgia who had brought in about 17 people. And last year, we had a woman that pretended to be disabled from Vietnam, and she had brought 8 children with her, all using the same passports. So finishing up to say there's a lot we can do together in trafficking to see how we can help the communities that are very vulnerable and being used by traffickers through Dublin. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think it's always very interesting to have a dialogue between UK, who actually opted out of a number of European instruments before it decided to leave Europe altogether, European Union, with relation to migration, for example. But I'm not going to summarize anything. I'm just going to open the floor to questions, including if we have outstanding questions for Siobhan, because she joined back, and I think she'll be able to take some questions. So maybe, Stephen, have you been looking at the chat? Is there a specific question to the speakers?
Yes, there is one question that goes to all the speakers. And the question is, are there any long-term plans to perhaps work with local organizations to educate about human trafficking? Is there, because there is a desperate need to educate in the countries of origin as well. So maybe this is one for, you know, all the panelists, but also there's question streaming to Nusha, which I have forwarded, you know, some of the questions around organ trafficking, and you know, if children are also considered as victims of trafficking, is it problematic or not? And I think that is it in a way. That wraps some of the questions that are really interesting in this session. So over to you, the panelists, for response.
Can I please very quickly respond on the countries of origin, because it's something we're working on here in the UK. We've been talking about working with the source countries where these women are coming from. And I know, Sharon, this is something you will have talked about earlier. If they're coming from Nigeria, it's working with them from the point where they're being trafficked. It's working with them from where the forced marriage is taking place to educate them, even though they'll still come because they think it's grass is greener, but it's to educate them on what to expect and how they can seek help. I think working with such countries is something that would be very, very useful in the way of ending this.
I'm happy to provide few answers if that's okay. Okay, so the first question is true, Stephen. Why do we use smiley faces on the cover of the report that we launched yesterday? That was because, you know, smiley women. That was upon advice from survivors, women survivors of human trafficking, who are advising us on the language and the imagery. And they said to us pretty much that they are tired of being depicted as shadows, crying and very sad. And they wanted to emphasize that the only thing they require from the society to respect them and to help them recover. They have all the strength in the world. They might be stronger than many of us. So that was the point, and we really went along with what they recommended, because who knows better than those who have been through it. The other question, should children be identified as victims of? Absolutely, children should be identified as victims of trafficking. And like adults, we do have a legislation on criminalizing the trafficking of children in Ireland, but we do not have legislation that specifically outlines how children should be identified. And this is similar shortcomings to victims of trafficking of adults. And we are now in the process of probably developing guidelines for identification of children, but I think that's an area that is lacking in Ireland, and it should be prioritized. And frankly, the children were part of the sort of the monitoring the civil society was providing to the trafficking response in Ireland for as long as children were accommodated in hostels for asylum-seeking children. As soon as they were moved to foster arrangements in Ireland, so for any suspected child victim of trafficking, when they started accommodating in foster arrangements, which was much preferable by any laws, we lost a view, a track record, and you know, and we had no longer enough information to assess what is happening with children. But I hear from colleagues who specialize in children's rights that the identification is by no means satisfactory in Ireland. About organs, I haven't heard of cases of organ trafficking in Ireland so far. I hope there aren't any. I am also asking Professor Siobhan Mulally in case she knows of something, but I know that Israel was quite infamous for cases of organ trafficking in the past, and usually this is happening when the laws around organ transplantation are lacking, and this is always a magnet for or for sale and trafficking of organs. And I have heard lately from a colleague of mine, Jennifer Ukeke, who is our anti-trafficking officer, that she has read reports about clinics for transplantation in Northern African countries now, where the transplantation procedures are lacking regulations, which also attracts traffickers for the purposes of organ removal and organ sale and all these horrendous things. And I think these are the questions I wanted to answer. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to just address the question in relation to interagency work in terms of a national referral mechanism. Yes, in Ireland there is that. There is a network of agencies, and in the reports, those agencies are listed. And I think what we are advocating for, and just as the output of this conference, is the active involvement of AkiDwA as well, and the inclusion as one of the NGOs that are stakeholders, because we've highlighted here that Black and ethnic minority, basically women from African communities, they need victim support. And we strongly feel that AkiDwA is in the position to actively support them and accompany them throughout the entire process. And so, yes, there is an interagency system going on in terms of an NGO alliance. It's not a formal alliance, but it's implied with the procedure. So we're calling for this to be legislated so we can have more of a backing as well as funding allocated too. So it's one thing to have that alliance on paper. It's one thing for effective funding to be given to these organizations to carry out the work necessary. Thanks.
I do not know if we have any.
Well, thanks, Zobnina. There's also, I think there's a question for Hanana,
Yeah.
about, I think it's posted on the chat.
What's about Somali
So
women?
you can have a look. It's about you know, how there's a language barrier with working with Somali women, and you know, have you you know, encountered that, and how is the best way to help, especially on a charity model?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, we do have Somali women. In fact, we've got a rising number of Somali women because they're growing in the local population. And there can be a language barrier. And usually, obviously, if the staff can't speak the language, we do also use volunteers, and we use interpretation services in order to translate. So we do help women. It's making sure you have proper interpretation services to help you. Um, and one of the things I've found is that when you're doing support group, as opposed to advice work, when you're doing support group work with women, they often form peer support groups amongst themselves as well. So they have a number of Somali women, some who could speak English, some, you know, some who don't speak English, and that also helps in terms of communication and their involvement in the organization. And of course, interpretation can be expensive, and you try to minimize the kind of use of professional agencies, but you can't always avoid that, and you have to try to raise money to have that if you don't have that language in-house.
Right. Sorry, I'll just take the last question here. And it's that is there a demand for trafficking of women for domestic labor in Ireland, or would labor trafficking be mostly men in the cases that you have come across? So I think this is a question for all the panelists to respond. Thank you.
Go on,
You-
Nisha.
I would like to, before I answer about trafficking for domestic service, I wanted to flag something that we will be embarking on a training program for human trafficking, and we would really like to link with AkiDwA and with all the friends of AkiDwA and see where the gaps for training lie, and we would like to work with you. We have prepared programs with training various entities pages by now, and we are updating these training materials we have, so we'll be happy to. And about trafficking for domestic service, it affects primarily women. There is some demand. Identification of victims shows that there is a small demand for this. Ireland has undertaken a few steps to better this labor realm, so to say. But by far, it's not ideal, but it is happening.
I think we had a very bad connection to you, Nusha. We didn't hear your last words.
Okay. I'm just saying that there probably is a demand for domestic servitude. It is a very sort of gender specific or women specific type of human trafficking. And I don't know whether you heard before that Thailand took some steps to better regulate, at least through guidelines, this labor realm. So there are few cases that are identified, but this is not an indication of the real scale of the problem.
Maybe I can say one word on this more from a European perspective that we observe. There definitely have always been a demand for women to be exploited in domestic work, domestic servitude. And it happens both within Europe, when women are already in Europe, and we have real cases, particularly in the countries like Italy and Spain, where there is a very large sector of economy relying on domestic work, and it is unregulated. I think the structure of the economic structure and the household dependence on domestic workers is a little bit different in Ireland in comparison with some other regions. It doesn't mean that demand does not exist. But also I wanted to say this from my long experience on this. What is important to remember when women, if there is a demand and they're exploited in domestic work, there is always, almost always, an element of sexual exploitation as well. And this is because they're women. So it starts maybe just with if there is an exploitation, if the woman is exploited in domestic work, there is no reason for us to think that she also will not be exploited sexually or sexually harassed or somehow groomed into unwanted sexual activities. It is always an additional element to this. I just wanted to flag this. And I have to apologize, but I have to leave because I'm already 10 minutes late for another meeting. And I want to thank everyone and the speakers and participants and organizers. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And just actually to conclude, I think we should have more time because these are very sensitive issues, but they're issues that we also trying to explore, and learning more and hearing more from people who have been working on these issues for a long time. It actually still shows that in Ireland, we are still a long way to go. And I hope that, we can keep these issues, on our agenda, to discuss them and to talk about them. I know together with the Migrant Council of Ireland, we established a group called Migrant Women in Herian. We are launching a campaign. Actually, that campaign was launched yesterday on sexual and gender-based violence, and people can actually see about that campaign in the Migrant Council of Ireland website. So these are actually discussions that ourselves and the Migrant Council of Ireland and other groups and organizations that are there will continue to bring into our agenda and to discuss, into the debate to discuss about these things. We have a huge role to play to ensure that women are protected, in particular vulnerable women and women who are really still at the edge of, breaking down with the trauma and with the fear of the oath maybe that they have taken before, and all these things that we are talking about. I take also the point of Wanjiko and actually working with the source countries. I don't know how we can do that. You're only NGOs. We really need to bring government into our discussions and countries of origin as well. We also need to work on the issues of other hindrance, other actually issues that are affecting migrant women, in particular here in Ireland. We have the issues of habitations. These are actually the rules, the laws, and the policies that we have in place that continue to affect women, in particular migrant women, that they cannot actually live even abusive marriages or relationship because of fear of deportation or of losing of staying in the country. So we really need to talk about these things, including what I'm saying about independent status. We are hoping that, when the government is discussing about the white paper and establishing the state-owned kind of residence for people seeking international protection, that they'll take into consideration the need to look into vulnerable groups and into women who have experienced gender-specific harm, because these women need much more support. I'm actually calling NGOs and groups that are out there together with ourselves and the Migrant Council of Ireland to join up, to team up and form a consortium for migrant women so that we can be able to pull out these issues which are affecting women, whether it's in form of trafficking, whether it's in form of forced marriages, of which maybe they're very new into our work and discussion, but also in the whole broad area of sexual and gender-based violence that continue to affect women. And also linking up with the indigenous group and indigenous organization to be able to ensure that the provision of services and support that is provided to the women is actually excellent and it's good, and that it doesn't continue to affect the women that we present. We just spoke about the monitoring of the trafficking. I sit in the Irish Human Rights Commission. And actually, we've been talking about these things and also having Siobhan with us and hearing what we are talking about today. I think in Ireland, we are better positioned, and we stand in a better position to be able to ensure that women are protected, and not only protected, but supported to be able to be themselves and to be able to provide for their families, and also to be happy and active in their lives that they have ahead of them. So before I finish this webinar, I want to thank all of you, and even those people who have left. We had over 400 people registered for this webinar. I want to thank everybody who have participated in one way or another. I want speakers, you know, Sharon, Hanan, Siobhan, Anna, Nusha, Elizabeth, Wanjiku, and also Steve, who worked very hard to ensure that we have questions getting in, where Steve worked with us. We are actually engaging with men, because most of the time in our work in AkiDwA, we've come to realize that, you know, women actually have to bargain and negotiate with their partners, even about the kind of contraceptive they use. And so in our work, we are starting it slowly. And Steve is one of the people who is working with us within the organization. But just also to, you know, I want to thank our staff, you know, in particular Katie. Katie raised up your hand. She did quite a lot of work in organizing this web, and all the other staff, you know, who have supported, including Caroline, who is not here, Anne Waithera, Nengi, and Sharon as well, because Sharon also worked with us with young migrant women. So from me and from AkiDwA, I sincerely want to thank you. It's not that we have resources in place to be able to do good, but we mean well, and we'll continue to fight for equality and justice. That's what we stand for migrant women in Ireland. So I want to add up this webinar in that very note, and just to thank all our speakers again and everybody who attended. Thank you. We'll be putting all this information on our website, www.akidwa.ie. We have it actually on the chat. Thank you, and let's meet again maybe in the new year. Thank you. And just to remind you about our AGM, which is on the 5th of December. It's actually coming Saturday. We'll be specifically talking about our business within our own organization, but also talking about gender-based violence, in particular domestic violence, in the context of migrant women. And also, we'll be talking about the homelessness that has been caused by COVID-19, but also other issues that pertain to migrant women. Bye, and God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.